This particular set of sessions is really what we call Lecture 1. It's about the urban opportunity. We have 5 broad sections that many of you actually hopefully gone through. This is being run by myself and 2 colleagues from the University of Cape Town, Edgar Peterser and Sue Parnell. What we're trying to do here is to provide you a broad understanding of what sustainable cities are, to engage with questions of politics, a little bit of theory, an understanding of cities as urban systems, and also as sort of cultural landscapes, places where social and cultural transformation take place, apart from the usually understood technical changes and the economic changes that you see. Now, just as a sort of as a form of guidance, the overall course will have about 55 odd sort of chapters that we've broken it up into. Sometimes the chapter is broken up into 2 different short videos. We provide you with some basic reading material in each week, so that you get some sense of where the theoretical underpinnings are. The interesting thing, as far as I think, and feedback from you would be interesting in this space, is that we have some of the best people in the world actually who've joined in the course. There are about 30 odd of us. Most of us have been involved very intensely over the last few years in trying to frame this global agenda and trying to see how we could bring this to implementation. So what you're hearing and seeing, especially if you follow some of us and me in particular on social media like Twitter, is policy and process as is actually happening. In fact, I think we have a few questions today about COP22. I just came back yesterday morning from Marrakesh, where the negotiations around the Paris agreement now that has come together. So you'll have a wide range of different opinions from multiple disciplines and geographies. You'll also have people who come at addressing this challenge from many perspectives, from some universities from across the world. And also, quite interestingly, what we try to do is to present you real cases of processes and innovations that are happening over the last, let's say 10, 15 years, so it's very contemporary, and then try and connect that with how the process of implementing the SDGs, and particularly the sustainable development goals around cities, are playing themselves out. The only advice I would have to use at some point of time, it may seem that this is fairly intense. Now, because many of us come from different sort of areas and disciplines, and of course different countries and different urban contexts, some things may be difficult and other things may be easy. We're trying to provide you space to engage with a number of us through webinars and a whole range of other processes. And I'm really glad to say that the fora have actually picked up quite well. So in some senses, some of the most effective learning will not happen because of what's on the videos or maybe even in the text. It'll happen because you're actually having conversations between Argentina and the United Kingdom, between, let's say, North America, Canada, and a country in Southeast Asia. So a lot of the stuff will actually happen through peer learning, and we will facilitate that and provide some context, some understanding of theory, and also how this process can take itself off. So that's as a background, and as you well know, and as many of you have probably gone through, there are sort of 5 different sessions that are there, and I'll be addressing them as directly as I can. So I've got a set of questions up here. Of course, I don't think we have all the prominent urban thinkers. The urban community is small, but it's growing significantly. We have a few people. I think the community is much larger than 20 or 30 of us at the moment. There was a question, I think, from Raki about COP22 and the importance of cities in addressing climate change. Now, those of you who followed the process from before last year, in Paris, in COP21, which is where the Paris Climate Agreement was sorted out, there was, apart from the member states, that's the countries, actually participating in the negotiation, I think a significant new force that sort of a number of us were involved in mobilizing was really cities. And cities not as political forcing that we're taking over process, but actually making significant commitments. So the Covenant of Mayors, a whole range of processes led by institutions like ICLEI and C40 and the Mayor of Paris, sort of made a significant range of commitments towards implementing the Paris Accord, and particularly as far as the SDGs are concerned, what we call SDG 13. This was picked up in Marrakesh Of course, the urban people would, as you expect, would root for themselves, saying that cities are important and this is what's happening. But I think the important thing to pick up is what other people were saying. So, for example, I was in a series of important sessions with some of the key energy and environment ministers from across the world, the sort of ministers from countries as diverse as Canada, the United States, Morocco, of course. The chair of the conference was from Morocco. And I think many of them were saying that local governments, that is, in largely urban countries, or that means municipalities and municipal leaders and mayors, are actually very important to implementing the sort of the climate agenda. Because when we are talking about transforming energy systems, what does it mean in practice? It means basically that you have to transform your transportation system. Now, in many parts of the world, transportation systems essentially run on internal combustion engines. They run by cars and buses, which use very sort of carbon-intensive forms of getting from one place to the other. And there was, in fact, a very sort of dire prediction that the internal combustion engine would be a legacy technology by 2025 or 2030. This, combined with autonomous vehicles, etc., means a fundamental change around in how active transportation systems would work. But there were also conversations about how people would walk. Cities would be much more amenable to be sort of to use active forms of transport like cycling and a whole range of other things, apart from actually transforming the urban form to make that happen. So that's a very concrete set of discussions. There were people from the industries that were concerned about this. There was a very intense set of discussions about how one actually transforms the built environment and the use of energy in buildings. So two kinds of energy that's used in actually constructing the buildings, what we call embodied energy, how we could actually bring that down. So you had some of the leading cement and materials manufacturers talking about new techniques they have to actually reduce the amount of energy intensity in construction and, let's say, concrete. And then, of course, reducing the carbon intensity in that energy. So effectively, you have significant reductions in carbon. And similarly, there was one of the leading lighting manufacturers in the world who was actually being able to show that you could actually reduce about 80% of the energy used in lighting by shifting to LED-based systems and intelligent LED-based systems. And given that in some parts of the world, lighting might add up to about 15 to 20% of the energy load in the city, that's a lot. So 80% reduction on 20% means that you may have a 16% reduction in the amount of energy used to do things. So, these were the kind of questions we were dealing with, how we could implement this process. So, of course, cities becoming very important. But, the world is very fractured, both politically at one end and also in terms of how cities and even urban sort of metropolitan systems are organized, where people think of it in silos. And the real advantages is as we try to lay out in this initial set of lectures, is how we look at it as integrated processes. So the real advantages are really in addressing questions in an integrated manner as far as that's concerned. So of course, carbon footprinting is an integral part of planning for sustainability. The question, of course, is that we're just about to start to put together significant numbers of sort of climate or carbon inventories in many parts of the world. So this is a very new initiative. ICLEI and a whole range of other institutions have built up this Carbon project, which is trying to pick up, I think now for a few hundred cities, actual carbon inventories. Once you've got a carbon inventory, then you can move on to looking at footprinting. So, these are sort of evolving areas, and we will discuss them later in the program as we go down. There's a whole session on climate and risk and addressing these issues. Of course, many of the questions you have are very technical and may be of interest, and we can probably take that sort of offline. There was another question that I have up here from Nishi, which is in a very different domain, and that is how does one address the question of informal settlements and slums. Now, if you go back in history, and you go back to sort of Engels' classic piece of work on Manchester in the mid-19th century, it was about informal settlements. So the challenges of informality in slums are not new ones. I mean, we may seem to sort of encounter them in our daily life and think that there's something that have happened in the last 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 years. But actually, the nature of how industrial cities have actually been built out, the duality within urban systems, and both Edgar and to some extent Sue speak about them in their lectures, where you have a formal organized sector which has got access to a whole range of resources, including capital, and then you have an informal sector. Of course, this is a simplification because in most cities there is a continuum between one end of the spectrum, which is maybe high tech, high value addition, etc., and people who actually drive the urban economy and their employment in many parts of the global south. So the formation of slums and the resolution of slums sort of have deep structural roots. You can't address the question of informal housing without addressing questions of land markets. You can't address the question of social protection unless you address the question of sort of labor markets and how they're organized, and what forms of engagement and access actually function in different parts of of the world. Okay, so I have another question here, which says, what do you think? There was such few, ministries that Habitat through. So I guess when you talk about ministries, you're probably talking about ministers and sort of political leaders in Habitat 3. I don't know whether you were actually at Quito. Some of my colleagues were actually there. I was not at Quito myself. I was at the meeting before that in Bogota. So the thing is, the Habitat process has happened every 20 years. Many of us have argued that because cities have become so important in the sort of overall process, we actually have to engage and negotiate and learn from each other at a much higher frequency. Now, I think what happened in Habitat 3 or in the run-up to Habitat 3 was that the expectation of what happened in Paris and before that in New York around the SDG summit would happen in Quito. But the fact is that Quito was a very different kind of a gathering. Quito was actually a UN conference and not a UN summit. So heads of government, presidents, prime ministers, etc., come to a summit because that's where they come to, after a long process of negotiations, to a common position and take a political position to support something. UN Habitat was just a conference which brought together a whole range of institutions and stakeholders involved. It was, let's say, at least in my appreciation, a large World Urban Forum. We have the World Urban Forums every year or so. So this was a large gathering of 30,000 people, especially from the urban sector. But we must understand that the urban sector is only one in a whole range of sectors within a national government. So you do have to have a significant buy-in at the highest political level, whether it's the president or prime minister or prime minister and president's office, and also critically with the ministers of finance. So I still remember a conversation earlier in the year when I was opening a fairly significant meeting in Brazil with the Brazilian Minister for Cities, and the question I asked them was, is your president going? The second question, of course, when I got a negative answer to that was, is your finance minister going? So I think when we really come at the international level to try and bring some of these questions together, you have to have a buy-in at a sort of fairly high level. And Habitat 3 was not that opportunity. It could have been so, but it wasn't. So when we go back to the intergovernmental sort of process next year in January and February in New York, I think we will be starting to build on what actually happened at Quito, which is a consensus among the urban community, a whole range of urban stakeholders. But we need to bring in a whole range of other institutions and stakeholders to actually take this process forward. So you can see me sort of reading through these sort of stickies which have some of the questions coming up on them. Okay, another interesting question here. How is the shift towards identity politics that is taking place in many countries going to affect cities? This is, it's both an interesting political question and a very practical one. So, for example, in Marrakesh at COP22, one of the big questions to the American delegation, and I was in meetings with where both the American Secretary of State and also the Secretary for Energy were present, and many countries and many other stakeholders across the world were asking whether in the transition between Obama and a sort of Trump administration, would there be a significant change in US policy around climate change and around energy? And of course, this is a difficult question for people who are just about to go out of power to answer. But I guess my own take on this would be that we've seen over the last 100 years at least many periods of sort of populist kind of political engagement. The difference today, of course, is that we have much greater urban populations across many parts of the world, and in countries that are highly urban and highly connected, like South Korea, for example, what happens in urban politics has a very dramatic impact on what happens in terms of governance, what happens in terms of political power, which parties in particular cases, or in other cases, which constituencies actually sort of take power. Similarly, we've seen in both in North Africa and the Arab world over the last 4 or 5 years, and more specifically in Brazil over the last couple of years or so, the mobilization through urban movements and urban politics actually having a dramatic impact on urban processes, and vice versa. In some parts of the world, especially Latin America, and to some extent parts of Europe, etc., you have people who move from being a mayor of a large city like Buenos Aires to become the president of that country. So there's a close relationship between urban politics and and the governance of the country. And if you go back to what Edgar was talking about in his lecture, and the framework that he laid out, not only the PARQ, which looks at it at multiple levels and picks up a whole range of different sort of arenas of engagement, but also the idea of relationships between multiple different stakeholders, and the idea that power is not really a dualist concept where you have the governed and the governing, whether it's in class terms or otherwise, but a whole range of relationships and processes which are now becoming much more complex in urban areas. I think we get an idea of how populist processes can have a short-term kind of impact, but may not actually be able to shift things in the long term. Edgar takes a very interesting example of Johannesburg, if you remember, if you've seen that session, and the idea of the former mayor of Johannesburg, who I know a little bit, to actually set up a long-term engagement to bridge the gap between an older city that was broken down by dualist sort of relationships between races, between a dualist economy, and use these corridors of power, which in other parts of the world we call sort of transit-oriented development, to try and make that bridge. Now, there was a strong demand in some parts of the more disenfranchised parts of Johannesburg for a focus on basic services. But the reality, of course, as far as the city metropolis was concerned, was that the city government did need to have resources. So you have to sort of work a very interesting trade-off between resource mobilization, which happens through economic activity, through investment, and actually harnessing the relationship between different sort of regions and sort of partitions in the city, and the ability to then use the fiscal resources of the city to try and actually provide basic services. Now, interestingly, like in many other parts of the world, both in national politics and otherwise, this particular mayor lost his election, not only because of this particular question, but otherwise. So you can see that there's a complex set of relationships that are here, and you're right. I guess populist questions will become more important in some parts of the world. The question, of course, I think both in the short and the long term, is whether it enables inclusive urbanization, because very often populism also has got a very strong correlation with exclusion. So how that plays itself out and what relationship that has with social sustainability and the SDGs is going to be an interesting question, which I hope you will come back to us and all of the people on this course from different parts of the world, because the experience of one city may be very different from the others. The expectation of, let's say, crowds that sort of took over the center of Cairo and what they're seeing just now may be somewhat different from what their lived experience currently is. So good question, thank you for that. There's another question which says, what are the options for managing the commons through participatory governance? Now, we're really going right across the landscape here. You're pretty much putting me through the entire course. This is an interesting question in some parts of the world where the urban commons are sort of recognized. So, if you look at the SDGs, and specifically we look at SDG 11 as we were framing it, one of the core questions that emerged was, how do you deal with public spaces and green spaces? And in some senses, in many parts of the world, especially very, very dense areas where informality is quite strong, etc., you need to bring the two together, because people need access to both public and green spaces. So, it depends on the regime, because cities are not sort of, in many parts of the world, cities are not tabula rasa. They're historical regimes of land management, they're historical established traditions, both in villages and in sort of expanding urban areas on the periphery of cities, of how the commons have been managed. So if those rights are extinguished, then you have a new regime which comes into play. If they're not extinguished, you actually have very interesting parts of some cities where you have, many of the old Italian cities, if you go back to the Renaissance onwards, the public spaces were actually created by both the sort of the royalty and the gentry and the nobility in some cases, and also by the sort of growing bourgeoisie as they became more and more important. So that's a history in a particular location. In other parts of the world, there's deep contest around these questions. You have the statute of cities in Brazil. You have public gardens that are, or even farm plots that are important in cities like Berlin and Vancouver. And then of course you have planned cities in South Asia, where like in the center of New Delhi, you have a large sort of large urban spaces which are part of the monumental city that was built by the colonial powers, which are now used every evening by people who live in the old city, come in by metro and use them as public spaces. So these are questions that we have to engage with in context. And of course, there are contests between ideas of the commons as sort of as a framework for organization and management vis-a-vis private property. So there are interesting theoretical questions that come from different understanding of what the commons are like and how they could actually play themselves out and be addressed. And we come to some of these questions as we run through the course, especially when we start looking at questions of property rights and how we manage the sort of how we manage the urban fabric. Okay, there's a very specific question here on smart cities in India, and what is the opportunity to engage with them at this early stage. So, the smart cities idea was not born in India, it was born in other parts of the world. In fact, it was born, I would say, in two sort of loci of incubation. One is in particular cities like, let's say, Barcelona, who actually used a whole range of processes to bring in information communication technology, bring in the ideas of network society. Castells, even though he has taught and worked in the United States for a long time, originally comes from that city, from that region. So some radical ideas that have sort of come to us from the 90s and onwards. And of course, a whole range of transnational corporations, many of them are in deep contest in trying to sort of take control of what they think is going to be the next big revolution, which is the Internet of Things. So to give you a concrete example from Marrakesh that we were talking about, if every street light or street light bulb is connected to the internet as an intelligent device, then who actually controls whether the light will come on or not? And that would have a dramatic impact on public spaces and, let's say, the safety of women and children at night. So who actually controls that is, I think, a very interesting and a political question. So the idea of smart cities in India has drawn upon some of these traditions, but has been sort of, in some senses, been reconstructed using a fairly important Indian context. For example, the idea of basic services and access to them is an integral part of the smart city framework in India, because in India, given that such a large number of people don't have access to basic services and all the things that are said in SDG 11 and other parts, it would be impossible to conceive of a smart city without actually having this. And part of the debate, of course, is what is smart? Is the city smart or the people inside that smart? And I've argued in some cases that the smart cities, and we have written about this in Indian media, are really a subset of the sustainable cities framework. And connectedness is a very critical component of the contemporary city. And connectedness not only helps people who have access and power and resources, but actually is a very important part of the survival strategies of the informal sector of people who are poor and vulnerable. In fact, in some senses, what holds their social and economic engagement together is really this connectedness. So if you're an informal worker and you have a cell phone, you have access to work much better than you would if you don't actually have that. So we really have to understand these processes much better, and especially as, let's say, countries in Asia now have larger populations who are connected to the internet than in, let's say, North America and Europe. I think both the social dynamics and the social innovation will change quite dramatically. There are a whole range of ways of sort of engaging with smart cities in India. As a professional, people will engage with them either by working with government or working with consulting firms. I think the interesting thing that I've seen happen over the last year or so, as the smart cities are built up, is an engagement with citizens. So especially, I would say half a dozen or more cities have actually enabled a significant citizen engagement, which is not necessarily true of governance and city building in India. It's true of other parts of the world. it's become passé in some sense. It's become standard practice in many parts of Latin America, in parts of Europe, where citizen engagement is part of active participatory democracy. But that's not true of many other parts of the world, including parts of South Asia, some parts of Southeast Asia that I've sort of I have worked in at various points of time. So early days, smart cities are just about starting out. It's a grand vision, but implementing these processes, as we know, takes a long time. Transforming a city is not something that happens in a day, a week, a month, or even in a decade. Sometimes it takes 15 or 20 years to try and make these things happen, or enable them to sort of emerge. And I think learning that patience, learning how to engage with those questions is quite interesting and important. And this is what we're trying to bring to you through this conversation on sustainable cities. Another question on how we can think about planning the peri-urban and spaces between rural and the urban. This is an important thing that I've dwelt on both in the first lecture and then, of course, looking at cities as systems of systems. The world is transforming quite rapidly, but cities themselves, in a gross sense, occupy a relatively small proportion of, let's say, the overall landscape. They have a dramatic impact on the local and regional environments because their footprints are quite significant in terms of both resource use and negative externalities like pollution and a whole range of other processes. But the peri-urban trend is quite important, especially in parts of the world where cities are growing very rapidly. Those of you who live in cities that are doubling every 10, 15, 20 years know exactly what's happening. And this has happened in North America and in some parts of Europe and certainly Latin America over the last 50 or 60 years. It may not be lived experience at the moment in some parts of the city. So as you expand out, the relationship between the city and the countryside is very important and quite critical to try and understand. And like we tried to say, and you'll see that later, the balance between what is so-called rural and what is so-called urban is very important to maintain, because cities themselves can't actually deal with all the things that they need. They rarely can produce enough food for themselves, though urban agriculture and urban food production is important. And hopefully, as we move towards greater sustainability, that will become more dominant. We recognize the role of that in informal in cities in the global south more than they were otherwise. But the relationship is, and most of your ecosystem services, whether it's risk reduction or water or even dealing with questions of air pollution, actually come from the larger embedded process. And within that, I think we're not only talking about cities, we're talking about urban areas. We're talking about a system of places, and the connection between them are pretty critical. So how does one integrate and put that together is something that's really sort of is challenging to deal with. The framework that sort of has been pioneered in some parts of the world is called territorial development. So you look at the territory and the relationship between places in the territory, resources, the environment, and a whole range of other social processes, because cities and culture cannot be separated. And in fact, if you try and separate them, you're making, I think, a very serious mistake. It's not only economic processes and infrastructure that's important. So in that sense, linking up what's happening in the periphery and what's happening within the urban fabric is quite important. The challenge, of course, is do you have planning frameworks that not only deal with the urban and the built fabric and what sits in between, but also with peri-urban areas? Can you anticipate or potentially anticipate what changes are going to take place, where resources will come from, where the water will come from, where the food will come from? And as cities themselves transform themselves, in some parts of the world, in fact, in Europe, I think 10 years ago, before the big challenges of migration started quite recently, the big challenge that we were dealing with in many parts of Europe, especially Northern Europe, was of shrinking cities, of cities whose populations were actually dwindling. And the question there was, what happens to legacy infrastructure that has been built up over 100 years? What happens to parts of the city that have been left behind? And you have large built environments, so you have adaptive retrofits that are taking place. So we have to understand this in different contexts. So rapidly growing cities that are stable but need to transform the infrastructure because the infrastructure is very old. They want to transform their land use, and similarly, cities that are actually fairly young and growing very rapidly. And urban areas and urban systems go through these changes all the time. They're very dynamic, so you can't actually have a fixed notion of how this will have to be dealt with. And we're talking about sustainability. which is dealing with a whole range of dimensions, ecological, social, and economic. So we need to sort of bring them together in a sensible, simple way where ordinary people can sort of engage with them. And in fact, that's what good urban leaders do. That's what good mayors do. That's what good planners do in some senses. We try and bring these together. Unlike in national governments where we've been used to for too many years to actually break things down into silos, deal with them in specialist categories, which is useful and effective, but then the integration and the potentials for synergy as the SDGs present us are actually quite are lost in some senses. I have another interesting question on urban financing and how one can address that. This is a very deep challenge at the current point of time, because the imagination in many parts of the world of how cities can be financed is driven by the idea that, let's say, taxes would be raised from the local level, from the city or the neighborhood or even the villages. They would then ascend to the national level, and then there would be redistribution through, from, like we've seen in Edgar's diagram, from the national level to the provincial level or the state level, and from there back to the cities. Now, in actual practice, what happens is a lot of the concerns that we have in dealing with urban service delivery, in dealing with urban governance and management, are actually not addressed adequately, because the nation state, in its in its greater wisdom, is focused on other things, or in some cases, it might be captured by a whole range of interests which don't really have a connection with local questions. So I think one of the big questions we're dealing with at the moment, and this is an open debate, some countries have engaged with it and some others have not, is how do we actually rework the intergovernmental fiscal arrangements in different parts of the world, how resources are both raised and transferred. Do we allow cities to raise more resources? Where will that come from? Will that come from economic activity? Will that come from taxation on land? Will that come from value addition that's happening? And again, this will differ from context to context. And then how does that relate to the global financial system? Because today, we have large financial surpluses in some parts of the world, like in East Asia, which are looking for locations for investment. They really should be coming to cities and urban areas in, let's say, Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, etc. But the mechanisms to make those transfers, to make sure that the investors are protected, that the interests of poor people are addressed, are not in place. So it's not only a question of how you finance within a country, which is a very critical and important political and financial and economic question, but also how you bring across large resource flows to be able to enable, let's say, the introduction of photovoltaic rooftop systems, which are quite important for small towns in some parts of Africa, or even in places like India or Pakistan or Bangladesh. So, and we know they work technically in some senses, but how does one bring them to bear is quite important, and financing is a very critical part of that process. Okay, interesting sort of polemical question. Is the demarcation between the global south and western cities a viable idea? Again, it's a dualism. And we've said in these set of lectures that dualisms are not good ways of thinking of things. Of course, they help open up a debate in some senses where people are not used to trying and thinking in multiple categories. But I think those of us who worked on these questions for a long period of time sort of know that you can't put things into two categories and separate them into black and white. There's a shades of gray, and of course, there are multiple dimensions to a way of trying to classify and engage with ideas. So I think the useful thing about the Global South really is that it's a way of trying to signal at least two things. One is that earlier centers in which knowledge was created and is currently being sort of engendered and built out in cities which are very important in, let's say, in the global north, in North America and Europe, come with a certain experience and imagination of what the city is. Now, in actual practice, many of these cultures have stopped growing their cities. They're redeveloping them, they're doing a lot of new things, but they're stopping to grow them. So some of that knowledge, which came from the 19th and the early 20th century, is no longer valid in places like Singapore or Dubai or many cities in China, which are growing very rapidly. These are questions of growth and development, of equity and inclusion, which have never been engaged with, in the places where the knowledge is created, where the great universities are at the current point of time. And I think what we're saying is, not only is a practice actually happening in the Global South, because that's where a lot of the activity is happening, that's, let's say, a relatively objective fact, but The theory building, if it has to have anything to do with actually making change, and that's what we're trying to do in this course in some senses, by engaging with these questions with you from different parts of the world. The theory building has to be grounded in the problems and the responses that are happening there. If you try and apply a theory that was built out of, let's say, North America in the 1930s, where people like Mumford were talking about the challenges of the car, or Jane Jacobs in the 60s, their social and ecological and even technical contexts are very different from what you have today, where you have the internet available, where you could see a very rapid diffusion, let's say in the next 5 or 10 years, in some cities in Southeast Asia and let's say in China and the Australia and the Pacific, of autonomous cars, which is completely unthinkable in some senses. So how does that engage with how the built fabric changes is a very interesting sort of question. So this is a signaling that we're starting to build theory and understanding from many other parts of the world. And in some senses, I've seen very interesting examples of innovation that's happening in cities like Johannesburg, being transferred to cities in North America, to cities in Canada and the United States, because you know, a lot more innovation is happening in the cities of the global south. There's a question about you know, about the inevitability of urbanization. Now, that's an interesting question. I mean, you know, urbanization is not inevitable, and frankly, the way that we're going in many parts of the world, if we continue the way that we're going, we could actually crash the planet. And you know, we've seen what happens to cultures when they crash their urban systems. You know, that's a history of civilization, I would say, over the last 5,000 years. You know, you lose a whole range of things when you do that, and one has to go to some parts of the Middle East to see that very actively. In some parts of the Indian subcontinent, you can see locations where you had established urban cultures as far back as 3,000 years, and you know, currently all that you see there is sort of ghost towns and ruins in some senses. So it is possible to actually seriously impair the development of civilization because of unsustainable urbanization. So the idea that urbanization is inevitable and where we're going is something that is, I would say, a hypothesis at the current point in time. However, the fact that we are largely demographically an urban sort of planetary culture for the last maybe less than 10 years or so, and certainly economically we've been that for maybe a couple of decades or so, is not in doubt. The question is, how can we address the opportunities that this provides to deal with everything that we've laid out in the SDGs? I've laid them out fairly clearly in my first lecture, dealing with employment, dealing with inclusion, dealing with social questions, dealing with questions of gender, and dealing with minority rights. How can we address them in the urban context? And you know, the question of push and pull is a simple way of thinking of the movement of populations. But today, where it's no longer necessary to move your location of work in some parts of the world to be able to work somewhere else, a classic example which has become quite contentious in the migration and immigration debates is the idea of offshoring. You know, the idea of offshoring is that people like, you know, in many parts of the world can be working in midnight, like some of us are just now, and actually providing services in other parts of the world around medicine, around you know, basic information services, keeping the banking system going, is a new idea in some senses. So in that context in which capital and information is highly mobile, but people are not, the idea of push and pull in a global context is something that we have to sort of examine quite critically. And you know, the migration crisis that we're seeing at the moment in Europe, and we've seen in other parts of the world, is also tied with the form of globalization and the pull that global cities and urban systems actually sort of provide. But on the other hand, cities do need to have access to food and resources, and if there's nobody who's going to be actually growing food and providing basic resources and making sure the biofuels are available, then the sustainability of urban cultures is potentially up for grabs in some senses. So there's a question from Munir about do we need to redefine development which misleads us in constructing cities? Okay, I don't get that completely, but I try and address. So of course, I mean, we're redefining what development means in actual practice. The SDGs are an attempt to try and redefine that, not only in terms of a universalist agenda that sort of picks up everything from poverty to dealing with climate change and conservation of natural resources and production and consumption, but the question, of course, is more than redefining development. We have to rework the practice of development to be able to attain the goals that we're talking about. A lot of these processes have been running. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was in the late 1940s, just after the creation of the United Nations. And we see that there are deep challenges in trying to implement some of these ideas across the world. So I think it's not only the question of redefining, it's also sort of reworking the institutions and processes and the practice of development. That's really important. So asking that real question of what is development, who is it for? And I think the SDGs sort of answered that by saying it is a universal agenda where everybody, in some senses, has a right to a whole range of basic things. And it is incumbent on us as part of this new social contract to address questions of poverty. The end of poverty is something that we really have to effect in the next 15 years. Otherwise, in a global civilization of 7 plus 8 billion people, it's going to be untenable for us to be able to maintain the world that we want to, whether it's for our children or even in the current challenges and conflicts that we see, not only in places like Syria at the current point of time, but also within our cities. Like I've said in the 2 sessions, cities concentrate risk. So they concentrate opportunity at one end, but they also concentrate risk. So the risk element of cities don't necessarily sort of, accepting through direct experience and through the media, they don't sort of emerge very clearly. But I think that's going to be an important part that will move forward as we go. So of course, certainly redefinition, but I think redefinition in practice is what we need to try and build out. But that practice will be built on new ideas, new theories, which I think we're trying to build as we go ahead. So there's an interesting equation that Saurabh has put down there. It says sustainability is equal to self-sufficiency. Now, I'm not sure I said that in the session that we laid out. So this is one part of the idea. But autarky and interdependence are not sort of opposites of each other. So there is this idea. And this is let me give you an example of an old debate, which has been very important in the Indian subcontinent. So starting in the 1930s, there was a debate between Gandhi, who was a very important figure in Indian politics, and of course in his philosophy, which basically said that India should live in its villages. And at that point of time, and I would say even to the 70s and 80s, India did actually live in its villages. At the current point of time, less than a third of Indian population lives in urban areas. There was a contrary view, which is a little bit different, which says that India should modernize, and to do that, you have to bring people to cities, you have to invest in industry, you have to invest in a whole range of other services. There was a third view which said, apart from the economic development story, and this came from Bhimrao Ambedkar, the person who helped sort of bring together India's constitution, was that social transformation would only be possible if people who were excluded, who were downtrodden for a few thousand years, Dalits and excluded communities actually came to cities, because cities provided them the opportunity for dramatic sort of social change. So there is an ongoing contest on these 3 different views. They come partially from sort of experience and ideological positions, but they come from different points of the compass. And I would say, if you look at what happens today, it's a mix of all of those questions. You need villages and urban systems, and hence this the continuity between rural areas and large metropolitan areas. And one is not in opposition for the other. But in toto, both for the region and for the country, ideally, and certainly for the planet, because the planet is bounded, and planetary boundaries are very strong and severe, as we can see in around some cases, we have to close some loops. Your resource balances for carbon, for water, for a whole range of other things have to add up. Your accounts have to add up on both sides. And if they don't, there will be serious winners and losers, more than what we have at the current point of time. So yes, self-sufficiency is important, but it does not mean that you can be autarkic, because part of the process that we learn from nature and from urban systems is interdependence and being able to share and being able to build on the synergies of both the economies of scale and the economies of scope that cities provide us, and also dealing with the challenges of negative externalities. Question from Adina: can we speak about economic growth while maintaining sustainability? Now, this is a very broad and sweeping question in some senses. I would say yes, in some contexts. So in some parts of the world, to be able to actually grow one's economy is a very important part of bringing people out of poverty. And China has used that strategy very effectively over the last 15 or 20 years. It's urbanized, it's grown its per capita income and wealth significantly, and it's brought the largest number of people out of poverty through that process in all of history. Now, is that an unqualified success? And the answer is no. There are serious challenges that come with that. You have a large number of migrant workers in China because China also has a dualistic system. It has the hukou, which is now slowly sort of changing around, which sort of keeps rural people in rural areas and provides entitlements for urban people in urban areas. And that was China's way of trying to balance out the urban and the rural historically over a long period of time. So there are deep asymmetries in terms of access, basic services, healthcare, opportunities for people in these sort of two broad buckets that we're talking about. There are also serious externalities that come with Chinese urbanization, whether it's air pollution, and those of us who've watched the Beijing Olympics and what's happened afterwards, something that's come from the form of industrialization that's taking place in China. Serious challenges of resource over extraction in some places. This comes with hyper-urbanization. So, these are the trade-offs that you have to deal with. The question, of course, is can you keep the balance and can you maintain these high growth rates for a very long period of time? Chinese growth has now started to slow, partially because it's becoming a much more mature economy in some senses at the high middle income level. But the question of unbridled growth has not actually happened if you look at the history of urbanization and urban growth in, let's say, Europe, North America from the mid-19th century onwards. You have bursts, and the question then is how do you use these bursts most effectively? How do you enable them to enable inclusion? And of course, there are many views of how you can manage that. One view, for example, sort of what I would call the Kuznets-ian view, is that you let things become unequal for some period of time, but the growth will actually then lift all boats. And if you listen to economists on this question or particular persuasion, that's the argument they give, that a rising tide will lift all boats. But in actual practice, what we see from both the theoretical work of people like Piketty, and we'll talk about that later in some of the lectures later, is that this does lead to a whole range of negative consequences, both in terms of inequality and its outcomes, but even in economic terms. This may not be very sustainable, and it could lead to both bubbles and collapses at one end, and to serious cyclic challenges that we've seen in advanced capitalist economies over the last 100 years or so. So, this is a nuanced question. You could have a very advanced graduate degree on this question, and I'm giving you broad, sweeping sort of responses to it. But keep these questions up. We will be addressing them as we go through. Again, this course is not designed to address all questions about cities and everything in the world. We'll only pick up something that we can handle. But I think the critical question here is to be able to ask the right questions. So, are there any other sort of critical questions that we could pick up and deal with? I've got a few more that people have asked. Okay, so we'll try and pick them up and sort of run through quite quickly. I'm going to shuffle through a few papers here and try and see. So there was an interesting set of questions about the difference between urban areas and cities, right? So, we call this a city's MOOC in some senses, but it really is about urban areas. And, the definition of what is urban, what is not urban is very different in different parts of the world. There's no universal definition for what an urban area is. But by and large, in many parts of the world, once a place, a village, or a place grows beyond 10,000 population size, certainly 50,000 size, it's classified as a town or it becomes an urban area. There are other classifications that are based on density, let's say 400 persons per square kilometer, or whatever it is, there are different things in different parts of the world, and also based on the type of occupation you have. So we are talking about both urban areas and cities, and even within cities you have secondary cities that are much smaller. In some parts of the world, secondary cities are 100,000. In other parts of the world, like in my country, when a city is of 500,000, it's not a very big city, because we have maybe 60, 70 cities that have more than 1 million. Then you have large metropolitan regions which have 30, 40 million people, which in other parts of the world would be an entire country. So this is a continuum we're talking about, and we have to look at the relationship between what happens in different parts of the continuum and how we address these questions. And the answers are very different, and they're also relational answers. How do they link to each other? How are the flow of resources organized? How is the frames of governance put together? And territorial development gives us a way of trying to link up these questions. There was a set of questions about smartness and ICT and how they could actually change. I've dealt with a little bit of those questions in what I've dealt with just now. There will be a set of sessions which Jeff Sachs actually picks up on in lecture 5, which deals specifically with these issues and the opportunities that we'll see in it. The earlier thing that we were talking about in terms of urbanization, I think in the next set of lectures, David Satterthwaite will be dealing with this, in certainly in the reading that we've given, and also partially in the session that he's going to be joining us on. There was another interesting set of questions about how do we structure governance to maintain long-term planning, irrespective of the change in political power. Now, this obviously depends on the context of the country we're talking about, or the context of the city, because even in one country, you could have different political cultures. The political culture of Tokyo is somewhat different from that of Kyoto, because of historical and other circumstances in Japan. So these are questions that really have to be examined using the tools of both history and geography and local culture to understand what actually is happening. Because cities don't come from nowhere; they come from sort of a long historical sort of understanding. There was another question of how cities can learn from each other, and like we started with, Marrakesh was an interesting example of that, and we've seen that again and again. We have now a growth of large urban networks, and to give you an example of two of them, C40 brings together some of the largest cities in the world, a large proportion of the world's global output, to deal with the questions of climate change. They don't deal with too many other things, but they've been very effective in addressing climate change mitigation, getting large cities like New York, Johannesburg, Seoul, etc., to move on to a path that will actually reduce sort of climate impact and process. Other big urban networks like UCLG bring together, and I was in a very large congress in Bogota a few weeks ago, where there were about 25,000 leaders from across the world, which UCLG brought together to learn from each other and also dialogue with other institutions. There should be a YouTube video where I was leading a discussion where we had the head of the OECD, the Director General of the OECD, and the person from the UN who actually manages economic development, along with mayors from big cities across the world. The mayor of Montreal was there, the mayor of Madrid was there, apart from mayors from other parts of the world. And the question was, how does one deal with the role of economic development in cities in the larger framework of global governance? And you're finding that this cross learning is happening much faster, because I think we are starting to ask questions of a fairly sort of something that was taken for granted, and I would call that an urban legend in some senses. And that is that cities actually compete with each other. So while firms could compete with each other, I think what we're learning from experience in these urban networks and across the world as we work with cities in many parts of the world is in actual practice, cities are much, or city governments and citizens are much more able to work together, to learn from each other than actually compete. The competition actually happens in a different vein. And whether you look at the diffusion of LED technology that I talked about, the use of new forms of transportation, and you can see city after city picking up the idea of active transport using bicycles. So Dutch and the Danes have done that for years and years and years. And then suddenly it's becoming something that you find in many places. And in fact, even in Marrakesh, you have public bicycles there. Of course, most people who need bicycles there in the old city use bicycles because they own them, but they're there, I guess, for tourists. So these ideas are actually spreading very rapidly, and the internet and social media and courses and discussions like this that we have with each other have been very important in trying to understand what those elements are and how to take them forward. And then I think more or less the final question is, what is the interrelationship between SDG 11, that is a sort of standalone goal of cities, and other goals? And are there leverage points in the system which are more powerful than others? Now, this is an argument that I've used in many locations, including in our discussions at the United Nations. And that is, as far as urban areas are concerned, our interest is across all the goals. I think in the process of political deliberation, we focused on a single goal that brought together a whole range of critical concerns that are important for cities. But there were a lot of other concerns that were not or are not in Goal 11. Questions of poverty are very essential to dealing with sustainable cities. questions of education and healthcare are critical to urban, urban functioning, and questions of equity and gender justice are as important in cities as in other areas. So what we're seeing now, as we start moving towards implementation and learning from the experience of urban leaders across the world, people like yourselves who are practitioners in various contexts, is that these are highly interconnected. Now, when you say you're highly interconnected, the response that often comes back is that because it's interconnected, it's impossible to deal with, it's too complex, and of course, you can't do anything about that. But I think that's furthest from at least in my experience in different parts of the world, or even in my country, that's furthest from the actual reality. People who are solving problems in the ground in cities actually use the interconnection to make sure that things actually work much more effectively. So I think that is the opportunity that we'll have to learn how to use. We don't have enough examples of how they actually work and function in different parts of the world. I'm asked this question in many locations. What is the most sustainable city in the world? Which is the best system that's there? Which is the worst? Now, in actual practice, this is a multi-dimensional question, and it changes over time. So you can ask the question with respect to a certain system, and we need to look at the interrelationships to understand what's happening. So the SDGs give us a framework to start thinking about these questions. One has said again and again, what the SDGs have given us is the frame in which every country is a developing country. Because even some of the most advanced economies, the countries that have the highest per capita incomes, have serious challenges on the social and the environmental front. And similarly, countries that are doing extremely well on the environmental front have serious challenges because of poverty, because their economies are not in very good shape. So keeping the balance between all the goals, looking at the interconnection of them, and then deciding what is really important is really the challenge of the practice of urban sustainability. How do you set your priorities locally? How do you take those decisions convivially? How do you enable that process of decision making, which involves not only the key constituents and the obvious stakeholders that both Edgar and Supanya talk about, but also the hidden majority, the invisible forces and stakeholders in our cities who are very critical to making things happen. I mean, all of us eventually are citizens of some country or some local area. And as we develop more agency and understanding, which is what Cities MOOC is all about, trying to pick up nuanced understanding of what can happen, I think we will actually be able to address these questions much more effectively and leverage each of these things. Health is not more important than safety in some senses. They're complementary. So these are complementary goals. In some cases, there will be trade-offs. And in places which don't have tremendous amount of resources, you have to choose what comes first more than otherwise. And that, of course, is a political question. But like Edgar said, politics is not about being negative. Politics is not about some person oppressing the other. It's a potential to be able to create creative solutions based on, he quotes Foucault in some sessions, in the section, to be able to look at it not as a negative process. It's a process of actually building a new future and collectively arriving at a settlement and a whole range of processes and engagement which actually help us to move forward. So I hope this has been somewhat useful. I'll be very happy to continue these conversations. Many of our other colleagues who are on the faculty will actually join us at various points of time, and you see different points of view. You have different approaches towards dealing with things. None of us individually have a solution to the world's problems or even problems of a particular city. As much as you are, we're learning how to deal with them. So this is a collective enterprise, and the more we share, the more we're able to work together, the more we're able to build solidarity in helping frame the challenges and bring in the people who need, and I'm sort of most disenfranchised in the room. I think the quicker we'll be able to move forward in trying to deal with these questions. So I guess we are pretty much out of time just now. Thanks for coming, and bring in your colleagues and friends. Stay on board on this thing. And I think the conversation is going to become richer and richer as we move forward. Hopefully we will then move into trying to implement and make differences in the places that we live in, the places that we care about. Thank you very much.